Our meeting is 1.5 days long. The Secretariat has made available in the room the program of work. I will spare no efforts to ensure a successful completion of our work. And, of course, I will be counting on your cooperation to make full use of the time and services placed at our disposal during this meeting. Bless you. At this session of the multi-year expert meeting, we will, in line with the terms that were adopted by the Trade and Development Board, focus our discussion on how labor and macroeconomic policies can contribute towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. As outlined in the program of this expert meeting, we will have 3 substantive debates on, number 1, the role of the state, employment policies, and organized labor in addressing the challenges of employment creation in an increasingly globalized world economy. Number 2, the global and macroeconomic challenges to overcome gender inequalities in employment and earnings. And finally, number 3, labor institutions and macroeconomic policies for structural transformation and job creation. We will hear from our panelists, experts, other participants, and clearly from all of you, excellencies and delegates, who will address some questions to guide the discussions. To facilitate these discussions, Unctad Secretariat has prepared an issue note as contained in document TD/B/C.1/MEM.8/8 on how labor and macroeconomic policies can contribute towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. In addition, aside to the presentations that the experts are going to share with us, they have prepared short abstracts, in some cases providing reference to the research work that will be made available in the website of the Secretariat, in the form and language in which they were received. With regard to the outcome and in accordance with Unctad's practice, may I propose that our discussion and debate be summarized in a chairperson's summary under my own responsibility, in which I will highlight main issues expressed by you during the meeting and that will be produced after the end of this session. Therefore, at our closing plenary session, the expert meeting may wish to authorize our Vice Chair, cum Rapporteur, to finalize the report after the end of the meeting. The report will appear in all UN official languages and thus will comprise the chairperson's summary of a non-binding nature as its substantive part and organizational matters. And the meeting will submit its report to the Trade and Development Commission at its next session. Following this brief opening plenary meeting, I intend to switch to the first informal session. Is there any comment? I see none. I shall assume that we have agreed on what I have just outlined as the procedure for the conduct of our work. So decided. It gives me a great pleasure to give the floor back, I will say, to Mr. James Chan, who will be making some opening remarks on behalf of the Secretary General of Unctad. James, you have the floor.
Excellencies, distinguished experts, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this multi-year expert group meeting on behalf of the Secretary General of Unctad. The topic chosen for this third session, how labor and the macroeconomic policies can contribute towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, represents an opportunity for heightening collaboration between international labor organizations with which we share already many endeavors. Among the experts invited to this meeting there is a representation of current and former senior colleagues of the ILO. Let me take this opportunity to congratulate our sister organization on its 100-year anniversary. Let's hope that the discussions we will have today at the crossroads of labor and the macroeconomic policies pay homage to the efforts of the ILO over these past 100 years. Rethinking the roles of macroeconomic labor policies in light of the complexity of interdependence and in pursuit of effective international policy coordination is more important than ever. The role of income distribution and especially wage and employment and social protection, as well as fiscal policies, are vital to ensuring a healthy growth of aggregate demand and investment. Discussing these issues would not be complete without discussing the gender dimension of macroeconomic and employment policies. In extending our focus to the international context, this will be important to also touch upon the role of the global monetary system to contribute to a pace of global economic and trade growth that is consistent with the economic requirements of sustainable development. It will be important for you as participants to extract from the discussion over the next 2 days concrete lessons for cooperation in policymaking and, when necessary, for reforms. The discussions of this third session of the multi-year expert meeting on enhancing the enabling economic environment at all levels in support of inclusive sustainable development assume a certain sense of urgency as well. Already, 3.5 years have passed since we signed up for the ambitious SDG agenda, and will see few efforts undertaken to overcome worrying trends in the world economy that represent serious obstacles to our ambitions. The structural limit to achievement of the SDGs is posed by 2 trends: the global retrenchment of labor income shares and the weakening of fiscal policy, which together contribute to eroding domestic demand. On the back of these trends, policymakers may be forced to an excessive reliance on the growth of external demand, which not only disregards domestic needs, but which also may fall victim of a fallacy of composition. Another limit to the achievement of the SDG is an over-dependency on global financial markets, especially in developing countries, which has implications for policy space. We need to balance the push for international funds with the push for domestic investment. This sense of urgency means, among other things, that there is no time to get discouraged. The research work undertaken in Unctad, as manifested in our flagship publications and other work, as well as the impressive background of the distinguished speakers invited to this meeting, lay out with plenty of concrete examples the enormous potential of well-designed macroeconomic and employment policies to help address the above-mentioned trends. On behalf of Dr. Kitui and all of the Unctad Secretariat, I wish you fruitful deliberation. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, James, for your remarks. Before opening the discussion of the first session, I'm pleased to give the floor to Mr. Alex Izurieta, Senior Economist at the Division on Globalization and Development Strategies of Unctad, who will introduce the issues that we will be discussing during this 1.5-day meeting. Alex, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you all of you for attending this event. I must first stress that our director, Richard Kosulwright, was actually overbooked in this period. We hoped he would be here, but he is in a mission in Palestine at this moment. In these few slides, I'm going to make a very short summary of our background note, which I suppose all of you have. And so I will not make it very long, because I don't expect to say anything that is not said there already. But I will just highlight the main issues in this first slide, and after that I have 3 other slides in which I intend to belabor on some of the elements that we want to stress. So we start our work with kind of empirical evidences from the world economy, in which we realize that jobs and employment are the major mechanism, the means to alleviate poverty and to achieve the 2030 agenda. And at the same time, it is the way in which we achieve creation of employment, most effective mechanism to also help us achieving gender equality. Now, it is underlying this statement the also empirically validated fact that it is through the wages and through the household incomes obtained in the job market that we help alleviating poverty in a sustainable way. And for that, we need to help us with a macroeconomic framework, and we hoped to be able to stress all of these elements along this day and a half of meetings, in which our experts will also help us trying to bring in new sources of information and new insights to see how this macroeconomic framework is laid out. And as a matter of fact, we start with a basic, already well-established assumption that it is the source of aggregate demand. It is mostly due to the wages and labor incomes that are accrued by households. And it is this that, in a macroeconomic framework, brings in not only household consumption, but also stimulates private investment, which is a major factor also going forward. Now, it is also true, and that's one of the things that we stress in our document, that in order to precisely trigger private investment, and in order to sustain the stable growth of domestic demand, we need a very well-tuned, very well laid out private sector financial systems, as well as public sector financial systems. So the role of finance is very important here, as well as the role of its regulation. Now, it is also something that we stress in our latest documents, in trade and development reports, and documents from other divisions in Unctad, that without a properly calibrated, a strong international policy coordination, it's nearly impossible for countries alone to go ahead with a strategy, with a macroeconomic strategy based on the generation of jobs and incomes. And that implies that also our own policies have to contribute to the policies of every single country, have to contribute to the aggregate incomes of the world as a whole, and have to contribute to a balance of trade, as we will see in the next slides. So in the next 2 slides, what I'm going to do is to rehearse some of the supply side fallacies that usually are put forward as a way to analyze the different macroeconomic approaches. So one of these can be seen through the contradictions between micro and macroeconomic analysis. It is often said, and from a perspective of a single entrepreneur, for example, that would make sense, that the shortage of jobs is basically due to the fact that wages are too high, the unions are too strong, and there are too many rigidities and frictions imposed by public sectors. I hope that the sessions in this morning, I'm confident the sessions in this morning will belabor on this quite strongly. But the fact is that even if that seems convincing for a single individual entrepreneur, it's not convincing for the aggregate, because the incomes obtained through wages on the aggregate represent the incomes of the household sector as a whole. And that, in turn, is what triggers private investment. Now, it is true that on the short term that may work, but if in the short term it works because many entrepreneurs can take advantage of low costs, particularly of labor. But as soon as there is no sufficient demand, and we have seen that since the global financial crisis, as soon as there is no sufficient demand, the temptation is then to shift investments away from productive activities into financial activities, speculative activities, which are the cause of several crises, and we know that very well. The other fallacy can be understood from looking at the things from a single country perspective or from a global perspective. It is plausible for many countries individually to think that production can be stimulated by low wages. And that has been actually the practice over several decades, and most in particular before the global financial crisis. And that leads to a situation in which wages are low, production can take place at high profits, and it is possible, therefore, to export, outcompete other economies. But for that, we need also spending somewhere else, and that spending somewhere else usually comes out of overborrowing. So this contradiction between underconsumption and overborrowing can work for some years, but it doesn't work forever, as we have seen. After the financial crisis and after the few 2 years, basically, source of stimuli that policymakers put to avert a great recession again, there was a shift towards every country trying to increase competitiveness in order to get sources of demand through the external sector. That's the pattern we have seen. And that obviously imposes a race to the bottom, because every country is willing to do the same over and over again, which implies a deflationary pressure on global demand, because as every country reduces their domestic demand, there is also a tendency towards a deflationary effect on the global economy. So that's not the way in which we could address them the type of policy responses. And in the background document, we try to set out a kind of global conditions, what we call it a new global deal, which is something that will be also discussed in the sessions of this morning and also in the sessions of this afternoon. So the conclusion of our analysis over the recent financial crisis, the post-crisis and earlier crisis, is that if there is a way out, it's by looking at the global economy from the perspective of precisely the incomes of the majority, which are obtained through labor. There is another type of fallacies which attack basically or erode the ability to reach what we all desire, which is to avert continuing gender discrimination, because it is obvious, and we probably all agree on that gender discrimination in the workplace, and that's very important, the lack of recognition of contributions to economic output, and not only to economic output, but to the care economy and to sustain the social fabric, this lack of recognition is no longer admissible. We all agree on that. The problem is that we tend to resolve this by supply-side-only measures. That means adding female labor participation, for example, measures to increase female labor participation, when at the same time we do anything or nothing or hardly anything to increase job availability. Or when we actually add into the job pools poor quality jobs, and that increases precisely gender segregation and gender conflict environments. Another fallacy on the same sort is that we just have to wait until growth picks up, and then when growth picks up, then there is going to be some form of resolving gender inequities. That's another fallacy. What we try to stress in our background note, and we are convinced that in the sessions of this afternoon we will be able to address this fully, is that there are always policy choices to be made in order to ensure gender equality in the workplace and in the society as a whole. And these policy choices have to combine precisely employment creation with increasing female labor participation, but also increasing physical and social infrastructure. And the social infrastructure is essential as well, because there is a lot of lack of recognition of the contributions that women are already making in the workplace as much as in sustaining the social infrastructure. And these are all questions of policy choices and need to be made, and there is no excuses. So we don't have to wait until everything is resolved in order to go in making steps into gender equality. This has to be done, devised in the macroeconomic framework right from the beginning. Okay, so what's this macroeconomic framework about? And so this is my last slide because I'm trying to summarize here something like 10 pages for our document, so you have to forgive me. So we first stressed the importance of monetary and financial policies that had to be favorable to investment, to employment creation, and to stable labor income shares. That's most important. The stability of labor income shares from a macroeconomic point of view simply means that wages have to grow at par with productivity. It's as simple as that, and actually if we look at the wage shares, the composition of wages in total value added for practically all economies, as it's also stressed in many of the presentations of today, this wage share is declining. And this decline is what erodes global aggregate demand. And we also note that the role of central banks is also important, not only to control monetary variables, but most importantly, to trigger and to promote private investment, to promote employment. And to a very large degree, we consider that it's important to revisit the role of public sector functions supported by the central banks. In terms of public spending, income policies, and their choices, we stress the idea of employment of last resort. And actually, the presentation of Ms. Sandra Polaski from the ILO, which I unfortunately have to read it today, a summary of it, she also stresses this aspect. That means that when there is a sustained inadequacy of aggregate demand and of jobs, the public sector has to come in. And there are very strong multiplier effects of that action. So employment of large function and public expenditure on social service have very strong multipliers. Interestingly, many of the gender-sensitive choices that can be made within that framework, they are even stronger multipliers, and we will discuss this afternoon as well. So at the end of the day, income protection policies is something that will help us to sustain aggregate demand and sustain income. And finally, on the external sector, there will be a lot to say. We will address some of these issues tomorrow in the last presentation in the morning, I believe. But it is the whole idea can be summarized in saying that it is essential to strengthen domestic income in order to strengthen the global economy. And that should be really understood, that when we stress the importance of domestic demand, it's because we believe that it is domestic demand that will trigger the factors that allow for growth of trade, for growth of investment, for growth of also international collaboration through financial markets. But that means that there had to be a more balanced trade in which surplus economies have to contribute stronger to aggregate demand. There has to be some way of understanding that countries have to manage their exchange rates in order to maintain certain stability of real exchange rates, which is especially important for developing countries. And we have to understand that this also requires to revisit and to work harder on the international financial architecture to precisely promote these ideas. So I leave it at that, and I'll be very happy to exchange with you in the questions and answers session if need be. But I'm sure the experts that will speak after me will be very helpful in nailing down all these concepts. Thank you very much. Thanks, John.
Gracias, Alex. This concludes the first plenary meeting. Thanks to Mr. Chan and Mr. Isurieta for the remarks. I am formally adjourning the first plenary session and moving now to our informal session to discuss the role of the state, employment policies, and organized labor in addressing the challenges of employment creation in an increasingly globalized world economy. Drawing from Unctad research of recent years, we are well aware that good quality, well-paid jobs are essential for achieving the 2030 agenda. In both developed and developing economies, a high level of employment, but formal and decent employment, is clearly one of the most important ways of mitigating inequality and alleviating poverty along a sustained path of robust economic growth. I should add that it also contributes to social fabric. And in that respect, it's probably interesting to remind to all of us the concept of decent job, as it has been proposed by the International Labour Organization, and it states that decent job involves opportunities for work that is productive and delivers a fair income, security in the workplace, and social protection for families, better prospects for personal development and social integration, freedom for people to express their concerns, organize, and participate in the decisions that affect their lives, and equality of opportunity and treatment for all women and men. These kind of jobs, decent and well-paid jobs, are not only good goals in themselves, they also represent an essential element of an inclusive society. They also guarantee to keep the necessarily pace of aggregate demand that underpins technological progress, which is ultimately the trigger of productivity growth. I will add as well that the existence or the reason for having decent and well-paid jobs goes well beyond economic reasoning, since a well-functioning democracy requires high levels of formal employment. From a global perspective, we also know that adequate levels of demand along inclusive societies are the trigger of a balanced growth of trade and international cooperation. However, achieving these goals require active public policy. They require policy actions. The cycles of economic and financial crisis that have shaken different parts of the world over the last decade shows, as Unctad research has corroborated, that there is the need of public robust action from the state. For example, the public investment in physical and social infrastructure promotes gender equality, access to jobs and income, and boosts earning potential for men and women. Public policies are required as well to foster job creation, which should frame their objective in the concept of decent job, as I have pointed out. In this morning session, the invited experts will shed light on the structural conditions that contribute to explain the current conditions of employment and income generation in the global economy, and will suggest possible ways ahead. I'm confident that their expert insights will trigger a fruitful exchange with all of you, excellencies and delegates, and ultimately will help informing our economic policy challenges. We are privileged to have with us and hear from the following distinguished speakers in this morning. Sandra Polanski, she's the former Deputy Director General for Policy of International Labour Organization. Shang-Hyun Lee, he's the Director of the Employment Policy Department from the International Labour Organization. Georgios Altintsis, he is an Economic and Social Policy Officer from the International Trade Union Confederation. And Jeronimo Capaldo, he is an economist at Unctad and Associate Researcher of the Global Development and Environment Institute from Tufts University, who will present joint research conduct with Servas Storm, Professor at Delft University of Technology. Gentlemen, I think that all of you have already taken their place. We invite you to present your views. And let's start with Mrs. Sandra Pulaski. Unfortunately, she was unable to join us today due to a family emergency, but she has offered her presentation as an input to this meeting. You have some printed copies of the presentation available, and of course, her paper will be in Unctad's website. Mr. Izurrieta will read a short summary of her main findings. Mr. Pulaski, I should mention, she was Deputy Director General for Policy of the International Labour Organization from 2012 to 2016. Prior to that, she served as the U.S. Deputy Undersecretary of Labor in charge of the International Labour Affairs Bureau. She is the author of numerous reports, book chapters, policy briefs, and blogs covering issues of employment, inequality, labor rights, social policy, trade policy, and development. Alex, if you please could share with us Mrs. Pulaski's summary notes. Please go ahead.
Yes, as said by the chair, Ms. Pulaski was unable to join us, but she was kind enough to share us her presentation, which is available at the desk. So if you kindly pick it up when you leave, it is far more informative than the summary I'm about to read at this moment. So let me go straight into her main points. Ms. Pulaski, who was a former Deputy Director General for Policy of the ILO, addresses the effects of globalization on labor, wages, and inequality in developing and developed economies. She points out that, as it is now well recognized, the entry of China into the capitalist production system and the collapse of the socialist bloc economies led to a more than doubling of the socialist bloc of the labor force that was effectively available to production activities, to global capital. This weakened labor's bargaining power and income and shifted it to capital. She argues that the shift was amplified and consolidated by conscious policy choices of many governments at the domestic and multilateral levels, and in her presentation she lists channels through which this has occurred. There are some 5 or 6 slides to this purpose, which are very informative. Ms. Pulaski provides evidence from the IMF and the ILO showing the decline in labor's share of GDP in both developing and developed economies and the patterns of wage growth. She points out that although the shift in bargaining power affects all countries to some extent, the actual prospects facing workers have been quite different in different countries, due precisely to policy choices on labor, wages, and related matters. So then she makes her point concretely through a comparison of the evolution of wages in China and in Mexico over the recent decades. At the time of China's accession to the WTO, average manufacturing wages in Mexico, in dollar terms, were more than twice than those in China. By 2003, the Chinese government began an ambitious policy of increasing minimum and other wages. In contrast, the Mexican government repressed wage growth. Now, at this point, at the point of writing, average labor costs in manufacturing adjusted for productivity are 30% lower in Mexico than in China. These choices, he argues, have strategic implications. Mexican labor costs now undercut U.S. wages as much or more than those of China, contributing to tensions with the U.S., while China has expanded domestic demand based significantly on these increased wages. Domestic consumption is now the largest source of growth in China, which increases the country's resilience to global policy shifts and global demand shocks. Now, she notes that there is room for continuing improvement in China's policy regarding labor share and household income, while also points out that the new Mexican government has already changed course away from the former neoliberal low-wage policy, raising minimum wages by 16% as of January 2019 and submitting draft legislation to increase workers' bargaining power. Polaski presents examples of some other countries' wage policy choices and highlights that this contrasting approach to wages is also seen in countries' development strategies. Some countries have preserved policy space for their own development and to build their state capacity and for industrial policy. Now, she argues that in the current global economic context, it is even more urgent than before for countries to choose a policy path that improves labor shares of income and productivity growth. And then she lays out 5 points, which I'm going to enumerate, on how this can be done, or how this kind of new context affects the ability of countries to move ahead. One is the overall slowdown of global growth. The second one is the weakness of export demand. The third one is trade tensions that could potentially disrupt global supply chains. Fourth one is changing monetary policy in large economies that creates market volatility and slows cross-border direct investment. And finally, the high levels of household and corporate debt that have again built up in many economies. So these are factors that she considers that impose new constraints, new restrictions in the global context. She identifies the broad implications for policy by national governments as the need to bolster domestic demand as source of growth and stability by raising wages and incomes and using fiscal policy to contribute to domestic demand. So more specifically, she urges national governments to guard and exercise their policy space, to emphasize full employment as an overarching policy goal, and to raise wages for working households through increased minimum wages and strengthen bargaining rights for labor. She also calls for redistribution of income from corporations and wealthy individuals to lower-income households with higher propensity to spend, and the construction of social protection floors as automatic stabilizers, which will also lessen the need for precautionary savings by households. She points out the governments should consider seriously the role of the state as the employer of last resort, for example, by learning from existing employment guarantees such as India's successful National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. Finally, Polaski suggests that governments that want to build inclusive development and growth strategies with a focus on employment creation should band together to resist external constraints on policy imposed through trade and investment rules. They should affirmatively reassert the need for adequate national policy space in multilateral and other cross-border agreements, including a space for industrial policy, public enterprises, regulation, and other policies in the public interest. And she urges governments to consider ways to build new multilateral support and priority for policies of full employment, rights, wage increases, and redistribution, including by drawing on the ideas of these issues presented by Unctad. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Alex, for sharing with us the summary, and in absence, thanks as well to Ms. Polanski for insights and for the presentation. I'm pleased now to request Mr. Shang-Hyun Lee to share with us his views on the issues at hand. He is the Director of the Employment Policy Department of the International Labour Organization, which leads the action from ILO regarding the promotion of full and productive employment by developing integrated employment development and skills policies. He has written extensively on economic, employment, and labor issues, including articles in the International Labor Review and Socioeconomic Review, as well as editing volumes under the Global Research Project of Regulating for Decent Work. Mr. Lee, as well, is one of the main authors of the International Labour Organization flagship report, such as the Global Wage Report and the World Employment and Social Outlook. Mr. Lee holds a PhD in economics from Cambridge University. Mr. Lee, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, the President. It's a great pleasure to speak at this very exciting event. And I particularly want to thank my friend Alex for the organize this program. I know this is not a very easy one, but I'm very pleased to see he managed to put together very impressive groups of the experts. And also this is a very good example for how UN agencies can work together on the issues of the common interest. So the process so far has been extremely constructive, and I'm very certain that we keep the momentum in the future, and then we can create a much better synergies. So I appreciate on that. Today I'm asked to talk about the full employment issues and the employment policies as a whole. But my previous boss, actually, Sandra Prasky, already has laid out overall the policy directions, actually, which makes my job much easier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at all the policy issues from slightly different perspective, adding some new elements of thinking, especially in the context of the SDG 8. So what I'm going to do briefly, my key actually take on this message is that of course, if we look at the history of the full employment agenda for, let's say, for last century or so, you can see big changes and evolution in our thinking about what we should do about employment. And so of course, many of you already know this topic very well, but I just give a very quick tour of what has happened so far. And then I'm just asking myself why we are talking about full employment here. Of course, that's a very obvious question to many of you, but I'm looking at those issues from slightly different perspective, which is basically about the value of work and employment itself. And here's probably I'm saying something very obvious, but actually with a very profound implication. I think it's very important to remind ourselves the work itself or employment is not just about the labor income. It's about health, it's about family, it's about the society, and beyond. So it's all about the political stability as well. So what does these obvious things mean? Which means the social value, not individual private value of work or employment, is probably much larger than the market compensation for work. And another point here is that our economic system somehow, for some reason, tends to underestimate of the value of employment and work. So if this is true, then there are very strong reasons for us to argue that the government should take a more active the policies to provide full and productive employment for all. So here I want to keep a little quick caution on this. When I'm saying employment, is the typical conventional notion of employment is very, very narrow nowadays, and just very limited to the wage employment, again, very narrowly defined. This notion of employment is not relevant anymore. We should be broadened to cover all different types of the activities, many of which are not paid in the market. For example, unpaid care work. This is one of the important topics for discussion today. So if this is true again, then probably what we need to do is the government and the public and workers' employment all together make more investment in employment, because we are systematically under-investing in the work and employment. This is one of the strong conclusions of the Global Commission on the Future Work, which was established under the leadership of the South African government, South African president, and also Swedish prime minister. So I'm going to briefly touch upon this. Just briefly, what has happened on the full employment? Actually, Sandra Prasky, she has already gave a more brief review of this. In the beginning of the 20th century, there was a certain conviction that the market economies will look after employment. So for some, the fluctuation here and there, but at the end of the day, market will bring us to the equilibrium wages where there is no unemployment. But it is clearly in 1920s and 1930s, governments and others all to wake up to realize that that's really not the case. So employment is kind of things the governments can work on through the very active policies. I mean, that is the period of the Keynesianism. And since then, there is the very strong global support for full employment agenda. And in light of this, and in the 1964, the ILO introduced the Convention on the Employment Policies, which calls for an active policy designed to promote full, productive, fully chosen employment. But since then, especially late 1970s, 1980s, and beyond, there is sort of an overall retreat, if you like, in terms of the full employment agenda. The policy focus tends to be shifting to the inflation and prices and information targeting. And also that was combined by the belief that at the end of the day, economic growth will translate it into the job creation, and which will allow us to achieve full employment. You may say this trickling down economics. But we know what is the outcome of this actually single-minded policy approaches. And so there is some quite years of the serious deliberation and reflection on this topic. And as we know very well, now the SDG 8 is all about full employment. Let me repeat what it said. It's basically calling for promote sustained, inclusive, sustainable economic growth and full and productive employment and decent work for all. So in a sense, we are in a kind of situation to reform our commitments to full employment. The question is how, and the question is what kind of policy we can mobilize to actually deliver it. In here, I just want to highlight, this is the big point I want to make. The employment jobs has much broader impacts on all aspects of our life, which means the employment job has very strong positive externalities, which may not necessarily fully reflected in the market compensation. Let me give a couple of examples here. First, economic impact. Of course, there is a growing body of literature basically indicating the job losses eventually leads to the output losses. In here, the impact is not just about the supply, human capital. And as actually Sandra Prasky mentioned, once you have the job losses, that impact on the consumption and through the losses in income, and eventually that actually had an impact on the overall economic growth as well. Once we have the structural problem like this, we may find ourselves in the situation where economists call the hysteresis effects. This is the overall macro level situation, as we know very well. Once this happens, there is no way back. So we actually continue to suffer the losses. But such effects are also observed at the individual level. As we know very, very well, once you experience involuntary job losses, this will have negative impacts on your job security and earnings in the future, which means this is not a one-shot game. Once you lose job, the consequences will last for the rest of your life. The chart of the screen, which may not be invisible to you, I apologize for that. This is basically showing the earning gaps between workers who lost job on the one hand and those who didn't are indeed very large, and this gap continue over the rest of life. So this is very important to know. These two effects, macro level and the micro level, are not temporary. It's permanent. And this also means it will be much better to prevent the job losses in the beginning rather than trying to alleviate impacts of the unemployment only after it happens. Second point is social impacts. The benefits of work is not limited to economic losses. It's much, much broader. The empirical evidence clearly shows that the job losses affect workers' health and the family lives, and some studies basically show the job loss may even increase the death rate even by 50%, as you can see from the chart on the screen. I know this is quite depressing, but it's the reality we need to consider in our policies. And also unemployment has a sort of spillover effects affecting communities and also neighborhoods. And social isolation and crimes are now very well-known examples of that. Given all of these effects, it is not surprising that job losses affect the overall social and political stability. So far, I have shown the economic and social, more political benefits of the employment or work, but it is critically important to remember the conventional discussion of employment is limited to paid work and or market activities. This excludes basically a range of the unpaid but socially very useful work, for instance, care work and voluntary work. So as the chart on the screen shows, on average, women contribute more than 260 minutes per day to unpaid care work, while men contribute only 38 minutes. So we're talking about 260 minutes versus 83 minutes. So thus, our so-called employment policies will be only partial, also ineffective, if we do not give proper recognition of these essential human activities and provide necessary social support for them. Now, what do all this mean? In short, as I said again and again, the social value of work is larger than the private value of work as compensated in the market, or we can say the work has positive externality, as I said. Some experts observed work is a merit good, like education and health. So this also means if we leave job issues just to private or the market only, then jobs will be less than socially needed. So another point which is important in this context is that the ability of the economic growth to reduce job losses. Economists normally they call this the Unctad law, which is basis in many cases for the conventional monetary policies. This relation between growth and the job losses is weaker, and in some cases getting weaker and weaker. And the chart on the screen shows in many parts of the world, already the linkage between economic growth and employment is weak. In some cases, especially in the low-income countries, and also in even the middle-income countries, this relationship simply doesn't exist, which means even if your economy grows, they may not necessarily have strong impact on the jobs. Therefore, we need strong public policies on employment, probably much stronger than we have normally thought. In particular, we need policies to realign private interests and to social interests in job creation. Obviously, this points to the question of our economic model itself, especially the way we measure and we manage the economy. So if the argument I have made so far are correct, then our economic model should be geared towards investing in sustainable development of working life. This overarching goal should eventually translate in multi-dimensional policies, but I just want to highlight three policy dimensions. First, we have to invest in new sources of employment, especially social infrastructure. I just mentioned one of them, the care economy. Second, we need to invest in people, especially lifelong learning and social protection. And third, and more importantly, we have to invest in voice and institutions. I use the term investment here. I know this has been a bit of the political rhetoric. We keep talking all of this in terms of the investment, but in many cases we end up with using it as part of a lip service. But we mean here real investment. We have to actually mobilize our resources, and we believe this investment will eventually pay off in both economic and social returns. Remember what I said, the impacts on the jobs, on the individuals, families, and community, and the overall economy. So it's worth invest. It's good money for value. So to make, and also given the tendency of the underinvestment in jobs, and this effort will create environments to encourage private investment. In other words, this social investment will crowd in rather than crowd out private investment. So whenever we talk about the public policies on employment, there is some concern about that this will eventually crowd out private investment. The way we see it is different. If we have a good public, strong policies in place, that will encourage private investment to follow. So we consider that the public investment as crowded in the private investment. To make this happen, we need to consider various specific policy options. One of them is as the Atkinson and others suggest, and also the Sandra Pulaski suggests, the employment should be essential part of monetary policies, but it needs to be more specific, like employment targeting. We have inflation target, obviously, but if we really believe the jobs are important for human life, for everybody, then why not setting specific targets for employment as part of our monetary policies? That is something we can consider. We also see some of the potential merits of the job guarantee schemes, especially at the local and the community level. I think this idea is somehow captured in the Global Commission report on the future work, which was released a month ago. So I don't want to get into all the details here. So I really want to encourage to take a look at the report. The report is very short, 50 pages. It's unlike the other UN document. It's very easy to read, so I very much encourage to read it. And that actually proposes basically the human-centered agenda on the future work. Under there, we have three the pillars of investment: investing in people's capabilities, and investing in the institutions of work, and investing in decent and sustainable work. So I just quickly show what's in there because I'm conscious of the time. I just want to have a couple of minutes to say something about the new sources of jobs. Our Global Commission report basically suggests many areas of the sources of the new job creation in the future, but the report particularly put emphasis on the four areas. One is digital economy, obviously. The second is, very important one, is the rural economy. Third one is care economy. Fourth one is the green economy. We believe these four the sectors with the great investment will pay off in decent job creation. So I know the care economy is one of the big themes for the conference today. I just want to mention this very briefly. As you know, the demand for care work is growing for various reasons, and particularly in the context of the rapid demographic changes. And at the same time, we know painfully that care work is not very well recognized, and predominantly done by women. So we have a growing demand here, but the relatively poor situation, the way we are doing. Also, especially when it comes to paid care work in the market, it tends to be poorly paid and with precarious conditions. So demand is high, but the job we are offering at the moment is poorly paid and not decent. So we need to invest more in the care economy, and we believe it will pay off. Our recent major report on care economy has done some simulation, and using the SDG as framework, In our calculation, in order to meet the SDGs in education, health, and gender equality and decent work, we need a total public and private expenditure on care service in the $18.4 trillion, which is around 18.3% of total GDP of the 49 countries. But with this investment, we expect around 475 million jobs will be created by 2030. It has a lot of potential in that respect. And also, we can say the same things on green economy. This is particularly important in the context of the rural development. And again, when you're using the target agreed in the Paris Agreement, and if we assume if the countries commit themselves to the achieving energy sustainability, of course, this is a big if in the current geopolitical situation. Our estimate shows job creation is expected quite large, especially in some countries in China and India and the United States. So it is also important this kind of investment has a strong spillover effect. So the message I want to share with you here is that if we have very good investment in those sectors and creating decent jobs, it will pay off in jobs. So these good jobs eventually make our economy much stronger. So this is one of the important rationale for the proactive employment policies we need, especially in the context of the SDG 8. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. I think it was very, very interesting presentation. I was puzzled by some of your some elements that you presented. Thanks a lot. Now I have the pleasure to give the floor to Mr. Georgios Altintsis. He is the Economic and Social Policy Officer of the International Trade Union Confederation. He advocates for workers' interest in international trade and investment agreement negotiations, the use of trade instruments to promote labor rights, and industrial policy for a structural transformation in the global trade agenda. He also coordinates the representation of the global union movement in governance processes such as the G20, APEC, and ASEM. Mr. Altintsis, you have the floor.
Okay. Thank you. I'd like first to thank Unctad for this invitation and also for the excellent note that is prepared, that Alexis Zurieta wrote and presented to us. And really, it's an excellent note. Take the time to read it if you haven't yet. I'll go through the slides just to get them behind us. And several of these information on this data are going to appear in my speech, in the rest of the speech. In this one, you can see how employment growth was before the 2008 crisis in several countries. Data is from the OECD report. In blue is the standard work, and gray is non-standard forms of work. As you can see, most of the countries are in positive in terms of growth creation, with a mixed but mostly standard work creation prevails. After the crisis, the image is completely different. A lot of jobs have been destroyed, and most of that you can see that is the blue part that is below the zero. So we have losses of standard employment and replacements of that in some countries with non-standard forms of employment. Another very famous graph, though that starts from 1999, there is another one from the 70s. The image is the same. The line above is the labor productivity index, and the lower line is the wage index. So those two are disconnected. In the next one is, interestingly, from an IMF report called Power from the People. And it shows that unionization is directly linked with the increases of inequality, in particular with the increase in top 10% income share. On the line below is union density on the axis. So in this one we have labor incomes share, and it's in full retreat in many countries. These are developed G20 economies. Spain has the biggest losses, but the image is the same in developing countries. So as you can see, Turkey, China, Brazil among them. So labor is losing part of the income it's making, and of course what's lost from labor goes to capital. In this very interesting graph, we can see that half of all households have debts and 1/10 is over-indebted. And the image, in fact, today is worse. Just have in mind that this data is from 2015, and private debt is very high in many countries. You can see Norway is leading, United States, Australia, and others have a percentage of indebted households up to 70–80%. So these were the slides. I'll continue with my presentation. So as we said, wealth and income inequality are at unprecedented levels. The Oxfam report for the G20 this year gives some shocking numbers in a very communicatable way. The 26 richest persons have as much wealth as the 50% of the poorest. 3.8 billion people on the one hand have the same wealth as 26 individuals on the other. Not only that, but billionaires' fortunes grew by $2.5 billion per day in the last year. And at the same time, the 3.8 billion people in the lower end of the income scale have lost 11% of their income. We see two major redistribution mechanisms in the economy. One is taxation, and the other one is labor rights, meaning unionization, collective bargaining, which then increases wages and transfers income from capital to labor. Both of these mechanisms have stopped functioning in the way they used to function before. I don't have to explain why this is obvious. Massive tax evasion and avoidance, and on the other hand, also a retreat of labor institutions and labor rights. This has disastrous effects for the economy. We have low household consumption, which also means lower growth, simply because those who have the higher propensity to consume do not have the income to consume. I know most of you have already understood that economic term I used, but quite usually I don't assume that everyone is an economist. Higher propensity to consume means, in a simple example, if you give 1,000 euros to a homeless person and 1,000 euros to an economist, most probably sorry, not an economist, a millionaire. A millionaire is going to... Not always. So the millionaire is going to put it in his or her bank account, whereas the poor person or a homeless person would put it right back in the economy because they need to consume, buy new clothes, rent an apartment, etc. So it means that the poorer person of the two, so not the millionaire, has a higher tendency to consume. So those people in the lower ends are deprived of more and more income. And that is a problem not only for workers, it's a problem also for the entrepreneurs and the majority of the entrepreneurs, small and medium enterprises. In fact, in some pan-European research on small and medium enterprises, entrepreneurs respond that the number one problem they're facing at the moment is not regulation or red tape or whatever the OECD is going to tell you, is exactly finding a customer. I also have the impression that governments are much poorer. Another effect, disastrous effect of this increased inequality is lower social mobility. Social cohesion is also crackling, and political cohesion goes with that too. See, at Brexit, for example, Higher income and wealth inequality erodes trust in institutions. Historically speaking, extreme wealth concentration has led to the demise of representativeness and democracy. It also kills the work ethic, because having an extreme inequality, it means that hard work is not rewarding. And in fact, what is rewarded is probably the lazy, idle, and over-consuming attitudes or attributes of wealth ownership. It increases corporate capture of political power, and corruption becomes endemic in politics. The lack of income, and that's something also shown in the report, leads to increased borrowing, both for the governments and the households. So what is drained from the economy by the rich is replaced in the form of borrowing and increased debt. And I'm pretty sure things are going to get worse. In fact, a few companies and individuals nowadays possess a wealth of behavioral and personal data. It is a secret, godlike knowledge that could allow them to unfold sinister plans for population manipulation, election hacking, spreading fake news and hatred, and in general do anything they wish in the pursuit of power. Governments look helpless in front of these new challenges, and so do people who vote these governments in and out, and they have lost faith in democracy and the very rights of elections, or how much elections could actually lead to change. In fact, worryingly, many of these governments are about to start negotiations in the WTO to write policy disciplines on themselves so that they reduce their own ability to regulate these digital corporations and quite often monopolies. The reasons why inequality is so high: first of all, the prevalence of precarious work. As I showed you in the first slides, the temporary part-time work, non-standard forms of work have increased. That's it, have increased worldwide. Informality is also on the rise. A second reason is protracted austerity that many countries either choose voluntarily, so to say, or international institutions leading the IFIs are imposing on them. Reduced public spending, therefore, has these effects. The third is a declining unionization rate and collective bargaining coverage. It's interesting that quite often the IFIs do not only prescribe austerity for a country, but also to decentralize collective bargaining, so the coverage of collective bargaining falls persistently. There's also reduced competition among firms for labor, which is an issue in particular countries. Quite often, for example, in the United States, in IT sectors, employees are forced to sign a non-competition clause, which means that they will not, or they are not able to look for employment in any of the competitors. Another reason, and that's very much explained in the note and a lot of other literature, is globalization, the competition among labor, especially countries that have adopted the export-led economic model, what we call the race to the bottom. Another reason is technological change, skills-biased technological change, and that has a massive disintermediating effect. And the king or queen of them all is a growing financial sector, the unreal economy, which is also growing, and I think Unctad has also demonstrated in much of their work in the Trade and Development report, in the note that we were presented today, how the financial sector is actually overburdening the real economy, how it lives off of that. And in biology, they have a term for that, it's parasites. That's what the parasites do. What do we propose? We propose an agenda based on rights, and we are not naive. We know rights are not granted. People have to fight and gain those rights. Rights to organizing, rights to collective bargaining, two very important ILO conventions, 87, 98, that have been agreed so many years ago, and yet not the majority of the world today are not yet enjoying. So the effects of the right to organize and collectively bargain is not only on wages, on which I'm going to talk in a moment. It's also on the occupational safety and health, the elimination of child labor, the closing and elimination in the future, we foresee, of gender pay gaps, the elimination of sexual harassment at the workplace and any other form of harassment, maternity rights, health insurance, paid leave, the weekend. It also has a drastic democratization effect in the workplace, which, if massive enough, can then spill down in other areas of politics, in the economic and social policy, in the macroeconomic policies, demands for social protection, for public services, of quality, accessible public services. On wages, there's lots I can tell. I'll just give you some figures from a friendly academic, Özlem Onaran from Greenwich University. She did that research in 2014 for the G20, for actually the L20, Labour 20, which is our vehicle in the process. And she estimated for G20 countries that if they would increase their share of income that goes to labor in the GDP from 1 to 5%, depending on the circumstances of its country, that could lead to 2% extra growth, just from the effect of giving more resources to the people who have a higher propensity to consume. And that is over a horizon of 5 years. I explained before how taxation all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but over decades has stopped functioning. And it's not only the big multinational enterprises that do not pay their taxation. In fact, we are pointing the finger to those governments that are allowing all this to happen. And it's not small islands somewhere in the Caribbean here and there. It's actually very big, strong countries, member of the G20, who should become responsible, and jurisdictions within those countries that allow it. So if taxation was working, first of all our governments, your governments, would not be that much indebted. Think about it. Instead of taking that same amount of resources from the rich in the form of taxation, your governments are now borrowing that from the very same people from the financial markets. So once you fix this issue, then the government is not in debt, but they also have resources to invest, public investment in physical and social infrastructure. Now, in view of the next panel, I'd like to draw this meeting's attention to two pieces of research that come out of my organization on the care economy, one from 2016, one 2017. And the scenario that we are building there is what would happen if a series of countries, mostly G20 countries, but also some other smaller countries like Costa Rica and others, would invest 2% of their GDP into the care economy. 12 million new jobs in less than a year in the United States. The effect of this informalization of jobs would be also great. And most of these jobs, fortunately or unfortunately, but they would go to women. So the impact on gender equality would also be great. For physical infrastructure investment, the same research I mentioned before from Özlem Onaran shows another more or less 4% growth for every 1% increase in investment, in public investment in infrastructure. And the other thing is social protection, which is, of course, a series of measures, unemployment benefits, skills development, pensions, healthcare, and many other things that the governments quite often do not spend adequately on, or they have to make cuts. And social protection measures have reduced poverty and inequalities for decades now, and they also increase the sense of unity in a country. It increases intergenerational solidarity, and in general they have the potential to transform the society by empowering the poor, combating gender stereotypes, building healthy lifestyles, and inclusive economies. Social protection also has a crucial role in supporting the formalization of the informal sector. This is what I had to say, but if I have only one more minute, Ambassador Chair, I'd like to stress a few facts on minimum wages. Minimum wages is by far the most effective way of increasing wages, simply because most of the people who are poor are on a minimum wage, when their country has established a minimum wage, that is. They set a wage floor, they have an important signaling effect in the rest of the economy when they are increased. Salaries throughout the income distribution also increase. Problem is that, as I said, not all countries have it. Countries that have it do not usually set it on a living standard, so they do not take into account the full basket of goods and services that a family needs in order to live decently. And they are not quite often updated, which means that year after year, inflation eats away some part of the minimum wage. And another very often problem is that we do not, many countries have set a wage, but they do not enforce it. So it's only a minuscule proportion of the population that enjoys really a minimum wage. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Artinsis, for your contribution. It's my pleasure now to invite Mr. Jeronim Capaldo, who will make a presentation on labor institutions and development under globalization. Mr. Capaldo is an economic affairs officer in Unctad's division on globalization and development strategies, and he's also a research fellow at the Global Development and Environment Institute of Tufts University. Prior to joining Unctad, he was senior economist at the International Labour Organization. Jeronim's current research focuses on international coordination of economic policies by using macroeconomic models. His most recent publication is Labour Market Institutions Under Globalization, co-author with Servas Storm, and forthcoming in the Handbook of Development Critical Reflections on Globalization and Development, published by Palgrave and edited by Nisanke and Jose Antonio Ocampo. Jeronim holds a PhD in economics from the New School for Social Research in New York. Jeronim, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. We've heard very good ideas from the speakers before me and persuasive arguments, but I'm sure that at least some of you have thought, well, this is all sounding good, but there's a clash with a very prevailing vision that somehow improving on our labor policies is expensive, and therefore, at least, for advanced countries, this might be possible because it comes down to spending extra money or allowing for extra guarantees. But for most developing countries, this might be difficult because supporting labor market institutions sounds more like a luxury. At least this is the prevailing view. It's a view, in fact, that we see resounding in many important influential publications. Now, as it turns out, and I want to latch on the things that the speakers before me had said. As it turns out, Sangon has made a very strong case that looking at employment and labor just for its private benefits, it's a narrow way to approach the matter. And this is definitely true. The fact is that even just from an economic perspective, the prevailing view to look at labor is very narrow. And in the research with Servas Storm that I'm presenting right now, I want to show why. And I also want to touch on minimum wage, as Georgios has talked about it, and tie with that. Now, the main narrative on labor market institutions, and that's all the rules that govern the labor market, and I'm thinking, for example, about dismissals, regulations, or the minimum wage, which is a very easy example to to discuss. And not in the sense that it has easy implications, but in the sense it's very frequently discussed, and therefore it's pretty straightforward to discuss about its ramifications. The typical narrative has two elements. The first is strong labor institutions are bad for competitiveness, that is, make a country less able to compete on the world stage. And because it makes a country less able to compete on the world stage, it's bad for growth. So having strong labor market institutions cripples the country's ability to export or to increase or guard its own export shares on the world marketplace. Now, there are many ways in which this enters the public discourse. There's plenty of comments. There's a fairly straightforward comment by James Buchanan that compares the ability of the minimum wage to increase employment pretty much like to water running uphill, so a physical impossibility. There's no way that raising or introducing a minimum wage can do anything good to employment, let alone to the economy. The conclusion from this view is that labor market institutions, strong labor market institutions, are a luxury that developing countries had better forget and worry about when they have developed. There are custodians to these narratives, and one of them is the World Bank reports. In particular, in the 2008 report, a flagship report of the World Bank, we see the famous sentence that laws that might be created to help workers, but in fact end up hurting them by weakening employment. The 11 years later, the flagship report promotes the cutting minimum wages, facilitating dismissals, and removing other regulations that favor employment and economic development, formally, but end up not favoring employment and economic development. So in 11 years, there hasn't been much progress on this view. And in a slightly more nuanced fashion, research by the International Monetary Fund talks about generous unemployment insurance that could help supporting labor and the economy, especially if it's introduced instead of other protections. So their idea is remove all other protections, have strong unemployment insurance, and that might help. The key here is that it's not strong unemployment insurance, but it's generous unemployment insurance. So the idea of a strong labor market institutions that promotes workers' rights and workers' position in the economy is a reflection of generosity, perhaps again as a reflection of a need for political stability, social peace, but it's got nothing to do with economic efficiency. And that's where the narrowness comes into play. The most unfortunate things about these prevailing narratives are basically three. One is that it's not confirmed by the data. The second one is that it's basically referring to a development strategy, the idea, what we call export-led growth, the idea that all countries can grow out of exports indefinitely. This is a strategy that is not sustainable for the world because obviously for everybody to grow out of export indefinitely, it's for a world that is a closed economy, that sounds pretty difficult. And the third problem is that these analyses that link the strength of labor market institutions to economic growth and the success of an economic model rely on a measurement of labor protections. And because labor market institutions are multidimensional phenomena, it's very complicated to establish a relationship between the complex world of labor market institutions and the unidimensional indicator of economic growth. So while it's easy to measure the minimum wage because it's expressed in monetary terms, it's more complicated to assess on a quantitative level, for example, the amount of labor protection or of the regulation of dismissals or other institutions. It's even more complicated to put all these indicators together into one a synthetical indicator and establish a relationship with growth. So we need another model. We need another way to look at it, possibly one that isn't so narrow, and we're proposing one. And we are, particularly in the paper that you can download in the format of working paper from the Institute of New Economic Thinking, and you can read all the details and look at the graphs and the discussion. But in the papers, in our research, we look particularly at the problem of late industrializing countries that surely have an issue of favoring development and growth, but surely also face a constraint on the balance of payment. So these countries need to export to promote they must export to promote growth and development, but at the same time, their ability to export is constrained by their ability to import, to pay for imports. And at the same time, looking at it from a different perspective, they need to import in order to invest, to grow their industrial structure. But for them to import, they need to export to gain the foreign exchange that allows them to pay for the imports. So it's a pretty serious constraint. And that's why we focus on these countries that are critical in this discussion of how much strong labor market institutions can be afforded. Now, we make several assumptions. We assume that exports depend on world income based on technological diversification. I'll explain this in a second a little more. We assume that imports depend on domestic income, fairly standard, and on relative prices. And we assume that GDP growth depends on the growth of the rest of the world, on the growth of capital inflows, unit labor costs, and of course on the exchange rate. So now, beyond the details of the model, the question is, surely strengthening labor market institutions can lead to higher wages. But the question is, what does this do to the economy? What does this do to growth and development? And here, the traditional answer is, it does bad things to growth and development. But a deeper look finds that this narrative is incomplete. And it's incomplete to a fault, because the conclusions of the incomplete narrative end up being quite opposed to the conclusions that we might reach if we add other important elements to this narrative. So what happens to growth is a story that has three steps. One is that when wages grow, certainly there is, other things being equal, a loss in competitiveness, in the sense that if wages grow, then real wages grow, and therefore the cost of a country's exports ends up being higher. But the other part of the story is that as wages grow, we know, because there's a ton of research that points this out, productivity also accelerates. And when productivity accelerates, the effect of real wages on competitiveness is offset, because the amount of labor that goes into one unit necessary to produce one unit of product, of exports, decreases. So the second effect outweighs partially or entirely the first effect. But, you know, at the end of the day, whether the increase in the wage does or does not benefit competitiveness ends up being an empirical matter, because whenever there is a depreciation or devaluation of the currency, nominal or real terms, what happens to the balance of payments depends on the relationship of the country's industrial structure with the rest of the world. So there's something we call Marshall-Lerner conditions that occur whenever a depreciation or a devaluation lead to an improvement in the current account balance. Now, so the effect of an increase in the wages is an empirical matter depending on whether this condition is met. But the fact is that whether this condition is met and is binding, or whether this condition is not met, we show in our extended argument, really doesn't have a strong effect on our conclusions, because labor costs end up playing are an important part of total cost, but they're only a part of them, not the entire cost. And when we take all the costs into account, then we see that this effect is partial. Now, there's also a third effect. The second effect is the labor productivity growth that is mentioned up there. The third effect is the industrial upgrading, and this is very important. As I mentioned earlier, it's important to recognize that exports depend on world income, but based on the level of technological diversification of a country. Because empirical studies show that as a country's industrial structure and export structure becomes more diversified, then it becomes more responsive to the growth in world income. It means that as the rest of the world grows, if a country's industrial structure is diversified, it becomes more responsive and more ready to provide exports for the growing world demand. And so this also offsets the impact of an increase in real wages on competitiveness. So summarizing three effects: a loss of competitiveness that comes from wages, faster productivity growth, and an upgraded composition of exports. But that's not the end of the story either, because research also shows, and although it's often ignored in the mainstream narrative, that there are at least three more effects that establish a positive relationship between stronger labor market institutions and the pace of growth and development. The first one is that higher or faster growing wages have a positive effect in the sense of making industrial relations more legitimate. The second effect is that they spur innovation in the sense that they can produce a technology forcing effect, because as less competitive, less technologically advanced and efficient firms go out of business when labor becomes more expensive, the more dynamically efficient and more innovative companies can in fact expand. And the third effect is that higher real wages lead, everything else being equal, to a higher labor share. A higher labor share means a stronger domestic demand, and it also means higher dynamic efficiency. Now, the labor share, to put things into a slightly more grounded context, globally has taken a very serious hit, both in developed economies and in developing economies. So a rebalancing of the labor share is a critical element for the health of the global economy. And the purpose of our research is to show that this rebalancing, in fact, is something that is very likely to favor growth and development and employment, and not to stand in its way. Thank you. So one element that, as a final reflection, is that the practical question is often asked about the use of these models is, well, this is academic analysis, but at the end of the day, we need these models. We need to produce policy advice or figure out a policy orientation, and so we need models that can give us these things. But the problem is that with the mainstream, with the prevailing model, we end up having a conclusion that says, well, when you don't know the impact of when you don't know many things about your economy and you don't know the exact impact of labor market institutions, you better weaken them because you're going to make your economy more efficient. Whereas the more complete narrative says, well, when you don't know exactly the empirical relationships in your economy or surrounding labor, and you still need to take a positions about labor market institutions, what you want to do is you want to strengthen them, because that's going to make your economy more efficient. So the conclusion of that is quite opposed to the one we started from, and that's the fact that strong labor market institutions are not a luxury. In fact, not having them is the luxury that developing countries cannot afford. Thank you very much.